from MTN, the Montana Television Network. This is Face the State.
Good morning and welcome to Face the State. I'm David Parker, MTN political analyst, joined by Chief Political Reporter Mike Dennison. Big developments have occurred since we last aired. Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton handily won their respective primaries in New York, moving their candidacies closer to the finish line. Bozeman businessman Greg Gianforte has launched the first television advertisements of the governor's race, and some national political pundits have suggested Montana's House seat might be more competitive than we might have anticipated. Joining our roundtable today to discuss these developments and more are Republican State Representative Matthew Monforton and political consultant Tim Warner. Thanks for dropping in. So, New York, big deal, Tuesday night. What's the state of the race, both for the Republicans and the Democrats in the presidency?
Well, I think that the Democrats have a lot of clarity now. It's probably going to be Hillary Clinton, and the big question becomes, well, who's her choice for vice president? That's going to be kind of what the cocktail parties are about in Washington, D.C. until she picks somebody. If she picks Senator Elizabeth Warren, that means that she's pulling to the left pretty hard. If she picks somebody that is not from Washington, D.C., not known as a national politician, but somebody with a little bit more diverse background, I think that'll send a signal that she really wants to appeal to a large block of voters and isn't just going to be kind of a liberal play.
Is Donald Trump the presumptive nominee at this point?
Donald Trump had a big win in New York, unfortunately. Every vote that Trump gets from Republicans is a vote of no confidence against the Republican Party in terms of its leadership nationwide, as well as its the state party as well. And unfortunately, there are a lot of those voters who are upset with the Republican Party, who believe, understandably, that the Republican Party leadership has abandoned many of its principles and simply refuses to follow its platform.
Now, we still have primaries here in Montana coming up on June 7th, and there's lots of talk about whether they're going to matter or not. Tim, I'll go to you first. In the Democratic one, I don't think it's going to matter that much. I wonder if you'd agree, and then we'll talk about the Republican one next.
I think, the Democratic primaries, the goal of the Democratic Party, as they've stated in Montana, is to just pick away and gain as many seats as possible. They may or may not earn the majorities in either the House or the Senate, but so they can try to get the governor reelected and then just pick away on policy issues. And it worked pretty well last legislature. But it remains to be seen. Certainly the gubernatorial campaign is a wild card for that strategy.
But in terms of the presidential primary here in Montana, though, we have Clinton and Sanders on the ballot. I don't think that's going to matter that much. Matthew, on the Republican side, of course, we have the primary and we have the delegate convention. What do you see as the dynamic there in terms of whether Montana's presidential primary matters on June 7th with the Republicans and how it relates to the delegate convention coming in May in Billings?
Well, for the first time in a while, Montana's primary actually might be important. We have 27 delegates. Cruz will probably get those delegates. If he loses Montana, then he's in real trouble. If he wins Montana, if he does well in California, then there's a good chance that he can keep Trump below 1237, which is the magic number that Trump needs to win on the first ballot. Trump will probably get, you can never depend on the predictions nowadays, but he's projected to get somewhere between 1,100 to 1,200 delegates. If he does that, then after our primary on June 7th, that's when things get really interesting. Trump is going to try to get as many uncommitted delegates as possible to get to that 1237 number, which is why Montana's delegates are going to be very important, because those are 27 delegates that Trump would like to have. If they're off the table for him, that makes it more likely that there's going to be a contested convention.
Looking at the landscape going into the June 7th primary, on the Democratic side, which candidate do you think is going to do well here for the presidential race? And then on the Republican side, which candidate do you think is going to do well?
Well, I think on the Democratic side, the chances of Hillary Clinton doing well are pretty high. Carol Williams out of Missoula and many other people that are kind of enfranchised Democratic leaders here are on board with Hillary and have been for quite some time. Sanders has advertised in Montana. He's had TV ads in Montana already, primarily targeting the Wyoming primary, but Sanders has, raised his his voice in Montana louder than the Hillary Clinton campaign from an advertising perspective, but I don't think it'll be powerful enough to overcome Hillary Clinton.
Clinton is probably going to do well in most of the remaining primaries. She's still got to win the James Comey primary, which James Comey is the director of the FBI. He's going to weigh in at some point, probably fairly soon. There's about 140 FBI agents who are working on the email scandal that Hillary Clinton is involved in. So obviously there's something there. Whether there's an indictment that's going to come down and when it's going to come down, that's going to be a big wild card for the Democrats. As far as the Republican primary, Cruz has a significant advantage here in Montana. There are a lot of anti-Trump folks here in Montana. There are a lot of pro-Trump folks in Montana who, again, understandably are voting for Trump because they feel betrayed, understandably, by the Republican Party. But Cruz clearly has the advantage here in Montana.
Let's put up that first graphic I have here about the state of the delegate count on the Democratic side. And if you look at that particular graphic, you're going to see a couple things. After New York, so you look at the blue, we got Clinton, and in the green we have Sanders. The first thing I want to pay attention to is we have the delegate count on the left, and I've only put in the pledged delegate count, not the super delegates. And what's really important with this graphic here is the percent of delegate target, which is actually computed by 538. And what's critical here to see is if going in at this point, that Hillary Clinton is at 107, 108% of her delegate target, which means by the time we get to June 7th here in Montana, she should have enough pledged delegates moving forward, where Sanders is behind that. Now, it's interesting, Tim, you tell me that you think Clinton's going to do well here in Montana, but I might slightly disagree with that. We have an open primary here, so the independents can move either way, Republicans move either way. Sanders has typically outside the South done well in those places. And on top of that, this tends to be a state where you have a low minority population, which I think is actually set up well for Sanders. Tell me why I'm wrong and you're right.
I think by and large, Montana is a moderate state. You know, our people are generally pretty moderate, want to have access to public lands, they want to have good public schools, and they want to have a good solid infrastructure. And they're not necessarily looking for a political revolution, which is really the Sanders message. Sure, there's 20% of the people that might say Sanders, and his political revolution, that's the right thing for Montana, and it's just not going to get too much higher than that. And I will buy you a donut if Sanders does win the primary.
Awesome, I'll buy you a donut. Okay. So Mike, I'm going to ask you to join in here. I'm going to put up this graphic here on the Republican side. After New York. And again, I updated this yesterday, and this is from 538. The big thing here is, in terms of percent of delegate target, going into New York, Trump, according to 538, had 91% of his delegate target. He's moved that number tremendously to 95%, so he's moving the ball down the field. Cruz is down around 57%, and Kasich I don't even think we need to talk about. So, Mike, you've talked to folks here in the party in the state. What's your sense of the Cruz-Trump dynamic here in Montana?
Well, what I found is I think that Cruz has more of an organization than Donald Trump. I wasn't even able to locate or find the person who is the leader of the Trump campaign. I talked to a few of Trump supporters here and there, but Cruz and Kasich are both better organized than Trump in Montana. And most people seem to think that Cruz will do well, as Matthew said, and that he may be the favorite, but we have an open primary, so we really don't know. I think there's going to be a lot of interest coming down to that May 14th delegate convention in Billings, the Republican delegate convention, in which local county delegates are going to vote for the delegates who are going to go to the convention, and they'll be bound on the first vote by who wins the primary. But after that, then they can vote for anyone they want to. And so if we have a contested primary at the national level, that's when that will come into play.
And I think one thing the viewers need to understand, with the delegate stuff, there's all kinds of other things that can happen. I mean, not only the delegates in terms of what they vote at the convention to support somebody, but the games leading up to the convention. We have rules that have to be chosen. These delegates vote on these rules ultimately. So there's a lot of consequences at these county conventions, but also the state convention coming up, right? Isn't that right?
That's right. And these county conventions, they've been going on in the last few weeks and still go out throughout the month of April. Then they'll be pretty much done. Then we'll go to the convention in May. And another question is whether or not any of these candidates are going to come to Montana, whether we're going to see Donald Trump or Ted Cruz or Kasich. We just don't know at this point. I mean, I heard some talk last week that Donald Trump may be coming to Montana. It wasn't confirmed at all. No one's confirmed anything at all. And other people have said they think Cruz may be the most likely person to come here. But at this point, like I said, nothing's been confirmed.
Have either one of you, Tim or Matthew, been a delegate to the National Convention in the past?
I have not, and I don't think I want this to be my first convention that I'm going to go to for reasons that it might be not only interesting, but maybe a little too interesting this time around.
Yeah, I've been to both the Republican National Convention and the Democratic National Convention. I think, my observation is the parties are more fun at the Democrats and the food is much better at the Republicans. But this may be the first time in recent American history that these conventions are actually newsworthy and actually kind of dynamic and interesting. And I think there's going to be a lot of people that haven't watched the conventions regularly watching those conventions this year.
Do you think that we're going to have a contested Republican convention?
I think there's a chance. Trump needs to do well next week, which he probably will do. If he does well in California, I think he will be able to get to 1237. But conversely, he needs to get to 1237 on the first ballot, because if he doesn't win on the first ballot, his chances of becoming the nominee are greatly diminished with each successive ballot, because the delegates who are bound on the first ballot are not bound on the second ballot and successive ballots.
Well, so what's interesting, actually, if you break it down, there was a wonderful piece at the Washington Post that kind of demystified all of this. And basically, all the delegates are bound, with the exception of basically the Republican committee chairman. But first round, 2363 are bound. But then what happens actually after that, it depends. Because Republicans love federalism. The rules vary from state to state. So on round two, actually 776 remain bound. And those are from Alaska, California, Florida, Georgia, and many other different states. If you go to round three, 185 are still bound. Round four, 124. And once you get down to that round four, those 124 that are still bound, guess what? They're pretty much bound until the candidate releases them. So what's interesting is that there's this math dynamic that shifts from round to round to round to round. But that's right. Here in Montana, what's the story again?
Well, the story is that on the Republican side, whoever wins the primary, all of the delegates, all 27 of Montana's delegates, have to vote for that person on the first ballot at the Republican National Convention. After that, all bets are off. They can vote whoever they want to, whoever they're committed to. On the Democratic side, it's a little more complicated. The primary results will dictate about 21 of the 27 delegates, proportionally what they get. Let's say that 60% of the Sanders wins 60% and Clinton wins 40%. They'll split them up that way. And then we have the superdelegates who can also choose who they want to support.
And to our knowledge, the superdelegates here in Montana have not backed any of the candidates.
That's correct. They played their cards very close to their chest and said, I'm not going to announce until after the primary.
Let's bring this all back down to Montana. Let's pretend for a moment that Trump is the nominee for the Republicans, and I'm sure that upsets you, Matthew, and Clinton is the nominee for the Democrats. As someone advising candidates running here in the state, Tim, what would you advise your candidates to do to deal with a Clinton-led ticket?
I think, and this may be true on both sides of the aisle, you have to run as your own person, your own candidate with your own positions in Montana, and not be kind of carrying the bag for the national party. I think Montana voters appreciate people that are independent, thoughtful, and really kind of look at their local issues and provide leadership. And the less a candidate gets tied into the drama of a national candidate, like for example, Hillary Clinton, there's a lot of people that like her, but she has controversy behind her. There's a lot of history behind the Clintons, and she's not necessarily the most popular person in Montana. So if you get tied to Hillary Clinton, or for that matter, Obama in Montana, it can be toxic for a Democratic candidate.
Is Clinton a better deal, do you think, to deal with than Sanders for your Democratic candidates?
That's hard to say. I think it really depends on the party infrastructure and how hard the GOTV, the get out the vote efforts are going to be. I think they'll be more effective if it's a Hillary candidacy than if it's a Sanders candidacy.
Matthew, what about you, Trump at the top of the ticket? What would you advise candidates to do?
I would tell Republican candidates in Montana to follow the example of Ben Sasse. He's a U.S. Senator in Nebraska. He said months ago, very early on, he would never vote for Trump under any circumstances. I think that's good politics. Trump is going to be bad news for down ballot races. But there's an even bigger issue, I think, for Republican candidates, and they need to think about long term. They need to think about history. They need to think about what it's going to be like to look in the mirror, to look at their grandkids 20 years from now, and be asked how they stood with regard to Donald Trump. History is not going to be kind to Republicans who march lockstep under Trump's banner, and Republican candidates need to let it be known that we weren't all like Trump.
But if you're running, though, in the fall elections, wouldn't you rather be aligned with the Republican candidate than the Democratic candidate? I mean, the only poll we've seen so far has shown that Trump beats Hillary Clinton by quite a bit in Montana. So is it really going to hurt Republicans that much to say, I support Donald Trump instead of Hillary Clinton?
Very little has been done in terms of negative ads, at least here in Montana, with regard to Trump. We're going to see a lot more negative ads against Trump in Montana. We're going to see a lot more negative coverage from the mainstream media that so far has basically given Trump a pass. That will end after the convention if Trump is the Republican nominee. It'll be no more Mr. Nice Guy from the mainstream press. His numbers are going to crater at that point.
I don't think so. I think Trump is a reality TV candidate. He had years and years of exceptionally high ratings in Montana with The Apprentice. His name ID is high, his character is established, and the Republican Party is responsible for Trump's success, as he is himself in building himself as that reality TV character. It's going to be really difficult he's basically been able to co-opt the Republican Party because of whatever failures the Republican Party has had in terms of leadership and policy position.
Well, he succeeded basically because he's a con artist. He's been a New York liberal for his entire career, and in the last few months he's suddenly discovered his pro-life bona fides, his conservatism. It's all a con, and it's just a question of how long it takes for most people to realize that.
What's interesting about, it's kind of hard for me to kind of say this since I've been wrong, and I certainly didn't expect Donald Trump to be the nominee at this point. But if history is any guide, and maybe it's not in this particular case, one thing political scientists have said is you look at a lot of those matchup polls that we've seen nationally between Hillary and Trump and Sanders and Trump. Early, they're not very determinative and not very predictive, but we're right now in the period where those polls start to actually have some purchasing power and predictive power. And the polls are basically showing Trump getting creamed by a Hillary Clinton candidacy. So there's some concern that might have this down ballot effect, that it's going to energize Democrats. They already tend to be more energized in presidential years, and maybe depress Republican turnout, which could have effect down ballots. We'll see what happens. But what I do want to move on to is going back to that primary on June 7th. And of course, Mike, you've been doing some reporting here on the open versus closed primary and the lawsuit that has been filed, basically moving Montana to a closed primary. What are the developments in that case? And then we can talk to Matthew more specifically about that case.
Yes, we can, since he's one of the attorneys on the case. And we're talking about the primary election only for Republicans in Montana. A closed primary is where you are required to register as a Republican before you can vote in that primary. An open primary, as we have now, anyone can go in and say, give me the Democratic ballot, give me the Republican ballot, and vote all those candidates at the primary. And recently, the state Republican Party has removed itself from the lawsuit. Some of the local central committees are still involved, and we'll let Matthew tell us why that's occurred and what it means for the lawsuit going forward at this point.
Well, the bottom line is the state party abandoning the lawsuit is a betrayal. It's a betrayal of Republican voters around the state who are tired of Democrats and teachers' unions crossing over and manipulating our primaries. There's no other way to put it. Republican politics in this state will always be a charade as long as Democrats and the teachers' unions are able to manipulate our primaries. Now, there are several county Republican central committees that are still in the lawsuit. I'm representing them. And they are going to stand and they're going to fight. We are going to continue to litigate because open primaries are fundamentally unfair and create unfair primary elections.
But open primaries, though, if you're going to get rid of the open primary, isn't that going to disenfranchise a lot of people in Montana? People who may not want to register as Democrat or Republican. It's going to take away their chance to vote in those primaries.
People have a right to register as Republicans in a closed primary system or not register as, in a closed primary system. If they want to choose Republican nominees, it's not unfair for the party to say, please declare yourself as a Republican. That's all that we're asking for. In virtually every other state in the country, that's a non-issue. People understand that Democrat nominees should be picked by Democrat voters, Republican nominees should be picked by Republican voters. That's not an unusual concept in most of the other states in this country. It only seems to be a problem here in Montana.
But Tim, what do you think about the court of public opinion on this issue? I mean, it's kind of an inside baseball thing. Do you think people out there who are just voting how they want to vote care about this? And if they do, what do they think?
Well, I think, you know, this thing we call democracy in America has evolved into a two-party system. And these parties are really, frankly, they're too big to fail. So anything, in my opinion, that reduces the number of voters for either party is bad. I think both parties should have as many voters as possible and have as much opportunity for, you know, there might be a Republican teacher out there, you know, one or two, you know, let's let them vote. I think a lot of people don't think of themselves as members of a party, but they describe themselves as maybe a Republican or maybe a Democrat or maybe an independent. And closing the primaries really disenfranchises people and makes it so people who should be voting might not vote because they think, oh, well, I'm not a card-carrying member of that party, so I guess I can't play.
In a closed primary, all you have to do is check the box that says Republican. No one is disenfranchised in the 38 states that have closed primaries. They simply are asked to choose which party they are a member of, and then vote in that primary election, as opposed to engaging in the kind of crossover manipulation that we see in Montana, cycle after cycle after cycle.
That sounds paranoid. I really think that, you know.
No, actually, Eric Fever testified under oath. He's the teachers union president. He testified under oath how effectively the teachers union is able to manipulate and move its members into key districts to affect our elections. And I got to hand it to them. They're very sophisticated. They do a great job of infiltrating our primaries and getting liberal Republicans elected who, quite frankly, aren't Republicans in any sense of the word.
Well, if the biggest problem the Republican Party has in Montana is public school teachers, then...
Oh, we love public school teachers. We have a problem with public school unions that tell these teachers what to do and that tell Democrats to infiltrate our primaries. The unions are the problem, not the teachers themselves.
You know, what's interesting is political science research would say this is full of sound and fury signifying nothing, that you don't really have different nominees coming out of open versus closed primaries, but who cares about political science research? But let's move on. I mean,
well, you're wrong on that. If you want to debate that, Dave,
we should debate. We have a whole show on that and debate that. But let's move on to look at the Montana races right now.
Okay.
Who's up? Who's down? What races are going to be competitive? You know, Mike, why don't you weigh in real quick, and then we'll go down the line.
Well, you know, the races we're looking at most, of course, are the governor's race between Mr. Gianforte, Governor Bullock, and also the U.S. House race, Representative Zinke versus Denise Cuno. Let's talk about the governor's race. You know, Bullock is acting like the incumbent that he is, and not really engaging Gianforte that much. Do you think this is going to be a close race this year between those two people?
I personally think it is going to be a close race, and I also think that the governor and the people that work for him think it's going to be a close race. I think the advantage that the governor has is that he's raising a lot of money. This is a person that really doesn't enjoy raising money, but he's working hard, and he has very positive name ID. He has very positive approval ratings. But I think that's not going to be enough to win. He's still going to have to really go after it. Come election time, he's going to have to be very, very aggressive in order to get his message out. Gianforte is already up on the air with probably $300,000 of airtime already, or near that. And the difference is, Greg Gianforte has demonstrated that he's willing to write the check. He's spent over $20,000 on airplanes flying around the state already. He's got TV up. This is a race. It's going to be very, very interesting.
Matthew, are Republicans united behind Gianforte?
Absolutely, and you mentioned, Tim, that Gianforte has been flying around the state in a plane. He pays for his plane. The problem that Steve Bullock has is that the taxpayers are paying for his plane, which all too often has been used for campaign events, illegally, I might add.
He's actually reimbursed all that.
Oh, okay, well now that he's been caught, he's been reimbursed. Or he's reimbursed for that. So the problem is we've seen that in the last few weeks. pop up. And I got to say, Steve Bullock has had a tough few weeks and some other issues too. He flip-flopped at the last minute on Colstrip. Greg Gianforte has been solid on that for months about standing up for Colstrip, standing up to the governor of Washington who wants to close it. Steve Bullock didn't do that until literally the 11th hour, at which point it was too late. And that's going to lead potentially to a lot of job losses, a real disaster for the folks that live in and around Colstrip. These people are going to lose their jobs. They may lose their homes. They don't have anywhere to turn. And it was a real lack of leadership by Steve Bullock to not stand up for these people from the get-go, and instead to stand up for radical environmentalists.
Well, the only people that would disagree with you there are probably the radical environmentalists. The Bullock administration and Steve Bullock, he has a job to do. He understands the process, and he has stood up for these people. But I think he also recognizes that there are challenges that face the coal market. It's the coal market that Colstrip has a problem with. It's not Steve Bullock. And we'll see how that game's out.
That's part of the problem. There's some market issues, but a big part of the problem is the regulatory environment that's being created and being made worse by environmental extremists that Steve Bullock is not standing up to. He's not standing up
and he
for.
said very positive things about Attorney General Fox's lawsuit, and
Except he didn't sign on the dotted line, which he could have done and didn't do. It's just another example of weak leadership.
It's inside baseball.
If you look at the money that Gianforte spent on TV, isn't that the right move to do now? I mean, isn't that exactly what he should be doing? So he's doing what a good candidate would be doing. And this is what Reber did not do in the 2012 race. He did not go on early and define himself. But here's the problem. He put a bunch of money in for 2 weeks, and as far as I can determine, we've had no additional ad buys. He's going to go dark. So where's that money going to come from? He has only $362,000 in the bank. Isn't he basically going to have to self-fund at this point? And isn't that problematic, or is that not problematic at all?
He's going to continue to raise funds from small donors the way he has successfully for months on end. Yes, he's going to write a check at some point. I think that's pretty obvious. But the fact that he's writing a check, if that happens, from his own checkbook means that no one else is influencing him. So that's hardly a strike against him.
All right, we have about a minute left, so I just want to ask real quick before we get to the end of the show. Zinke Juneau, a prominent political scientist, just changed the rating of that race and said it's a bit more competitive. Do you think, let's just real quick, do you think that race is going to tighten up and be more competitive this one?
I think it could, but at this point, I still think that Mr. Zinke is a pretty solid favorite.
Tim?
I think it depends on how hard Denise Juneau works. If she works really hard, she has a chance.
Matthew?
Zinke may have some problems if Trump is our nominee. He's one of the down ballot races that may be affected by a downturn in Republican support for those kind of races with Trump. Zinke's got some other issues. He was a supporter of the Water Compact, which is not favored by a lot of people. He's got some other issues with regard to his support of the continuing resolution in Congress in December, which funded Planned Parenthood, which funded the importation of Syrian refugees. These are issues that Republicans and libertarians are going to be dead set against, and it opens him up to a potential challenge by Mike Fellows, who is running. Well, Mike Fellows is already challenging him. What we might see is the same thing that happened in the 2012 race,
where we didn't even get to all the other races we need to talk about. We'll have to do this next time. Thanks for joining us on Face the State.
You've been watching Face the State, a presentation of MTN, the Montana Television Network.